philosophy.
We don't have any metaphysical commitments. They always want to tell us that.
Right.
But I always worry when someone tells me they don't have these commitments, that's precisely what they have is metaphysical commitments.
Right.
I would rather them just be honest about it. I think both of them in different ways, as I mentioned to you, have metaphysical commitments. Those metaphysical commitments are all sort of anthropological in their tone, right? So we communicate, we make sense to one another for Habermas. We recognize, acknowledge one another for Hannett. So that's really what they go from. Then their question is transcendental, right? What are the conditions of the possibility thereof? But
exactly.
I'm sorry. I see that we've got time here.
Ajimri was just sharing the link to the live on YouTube.
Oh, good.
Just in case anyone want to share with anyone else.
Oh, good. Thank you.
This is the link up there on the chat.
Wonderful.
So whenever you guys ready, we can start.
I'm ready whenever you are.
All right. Let me just post it on Facebook just to make sure that other people will be following. All right. All right. It is a great pleasure to have this afternoon Professor Kevin Thompson, Graduate Director of the PhD program in philosophy at DePaul University. Professor Thompson was educated at University of Memphis. His areas of specialization are German idealism, contemporary French philosophy, and the history of political theory. He is the author of Hegel's Theory of Normativity and the co-editor of Phenomenology of the Political and Intolerable, Writings from Michel Foucault and the Prison's Information Group. In addition, Kevin has also published numerous articles on Kant and Foucault. We also know that Professor Thompson has been working on bioethics, applied ethics, and political theory overall. Once again, Kevin Thompson, it is a great pleasure to have you with us. Please, you have the floor. Take your time.
Well, thank you, Anita, and thanks everyone for being here. Let me first say how honored I am to have this opportunity and how humbled I am that all of you have spent so much time and effort working through my study. I appreciate that tremendously. And as I said, I'm humbled by your attention to that. I look forward to all the devastating critiques and questions about my work. And as I told Nita earlier, this will be a display in how one person could be so wrong about something. So you guys will tell me how wrong I am about it. And I deeply appreciate that. The other thing I should say is I also appreciate you dealing with the language barrier that I have and letting me speak in my native tongue. I wish I could speak and listen and understand in your native tongue. I can't, so I appreciate this opportunity to do that, and I appreciate Nita for facilitating this today, this discussion today. I welcome all the questions that you have, and I look forward to that. What I'm going to do today is provide a brief sketch of the basic project of the study of Hegel's theory of normativity. And I'll do that by first outlining the guiding problematic that the book seeks to address. And then I'll turn to three of its core theses. So I have a PowerPoint or PDF for that, so you can take a look at those theses when we get there. But those theses are about Hegel's method, his distinctive theory of normative institutions, and his equally distinctive practice of social critique. Those all follow, I think, from his fundamental theory of right, Recht, that is to say, or justice, you can translate it that way. So first then, the guiding problematic. The problematic of the book is obviously the problem of normativity. And in particular, I know you've been through these things, so I'll be brief about these, but what I've tried to do, at least in talking about these first couple of theses, is not just outline what I say in the book, but also try to expand it just a little bit beyond what I say in the book. So I'll say a little bit about that. And then the third point I'll make about these social critique, it'll be basically what I say in the book, but also try to put that together in a useful way. So the guiding problematic then, the problem of normativity, and in particular the problem of the source from which normativity properly flows. Our lives are suffused with normativity. We exist amidst a wealth of practices and institutions, many of which claim to possess authority to place us under our obligation to comply with their requirements in our conduct and our character. Normativity is the feature of institutions, principles, practices, and states of affairs that provides us reasons to comply with what they demand. It is their binding force that entitles them to specify our moral, legal, and political duties. But from whence does this authority arise? What is the justification of this power? This is the problem of normativity, or more precisely, the problem of the foundation or source of normativity. And it is this question, I contend, to which Hegel's theory of right seeks to respond. To be right or just on Hegel's account means that certain principles, practices, institutions, and states of affairs possess valid binding authority over us, and that we are thus under obligation to comply with the rules, the duties that they prescribe, insofar as they remain legitimately within the scope of that authority. Hegel is quite clear that the foundations of his account of normativity lie in the systematic structure and the metaphysical doctrines of his general system of philosophical sciences. Accordingly, he tells us that the science of right is to be judged solely in terms of its, quote, philosophical manner of progressing from one matter to another and of conducting a scientific proof, the speculative way of knowing in general, unquote. The project of Hegel's theory of normativity is thus to offer an interpretation and a defense of the systematic foundations, that is, the core doctrines and forms of argumentation, upon which what Hegel calls the philosophical science of right itself rests. The approach the book takes is both analytical and historical. It strives to remain faithful to the core critical intention and intellectual context of Hegel's broader philosophical project. Its central claim is that Hegel's theory of normativity is defined by his innovative conceptions of normative argumentation, practical agency, and social ontology. The study seeks to develop this insight, demonstrate its textual fidelity, and defend its philosophical viability. Now, central to the interpretation that I propose is the distinction that Hegel draws between representational and systematic forms of knowledge. Briefly stated, representational forms of knowledge designate any form of knowledge that takes the validity and soundness of its method of inquiry and its object of investigation for granted, rather than as in need of demonstration. As such, representational forms of knowledge render themselves uniquely vulnerable to the classical skeptical attacks of hypothesis, that is, arbitrary ground, infinite regress, or vicious circularity, the so-called Agrippin trilemma. Systematic forms of knowledge foreclose these vulnerabilities by their distinctive and radical commitment to absolute presuppositionlessness, that is, to taking nothing, whether method or object, nothing whatsoever, for granted, to setting aside and disengaging from all inherited conceptions, all ways of taking a position with respect to ourselves and to the world. The resolution, as Hegel puts it, to think purely. The book argues, quite simply, that it is only insofar as Hegel's social and political philosophy is interpreted as a systematic form of knowledge, with all that this entails, that its concepts, claims, and doctrines can successfully withstand skeptical challenge, which is to say, it is only as systematic that the science of right would actually be able to accomplish its stated goal, the comprehension of the concept and actualization of normativity, what Hegel calls the idea of right. Now, with this overview of the problematic and project of the work in place, I want to discuss very briefly three of the theses about Hegel's theory for which I argue in the book. Those three theses are its unique method of normative justification, which I talk about in chapter 1, its distinctive institutionalism, which I talk about in chapter 3, and finally, its equally original practice, I think it is at least, of social critique, what I term Hegel's operative theory of public reason. This is in the conclusion. So if you can look at the three theses I provided on the PowerPoint, the methodology thesis says the justification of normativity requires a systematic demonstration that the concept of right follows eminently and thus without presuppositions and necessarily from the concept of freedom, and thus that right is at once the result and ground of freedom, its truth, and B, that the concepts of freedom and right are both structures of thought and categories of being. That's a systematic metaphysical view. I argue for an institutionalism thesis. Normativity is, as the result and ground of freedom, is necessarily objective. That is, it must be embodied in a set of determinate social and political principles and institutions, principles of ownership and conscience, but also institutions of the family, civil society, and the state, that together comprise a normative social ontology, what Hegel calls objective spirit. And finally, the social critique thesis. Social critique is able to examine and evaluate the soundness of existing social and political institutions and practices, claims to be authoritative, just, good, and right, because systematic justification establishes and hermeneutic interpretation in turn polemically appeals to the actuality of right, the principle of objective freedom, as the supreme standard of critique that underlies the contingencies of the present. So let me talk about each one of those a bit more. First, about method. This is really condensation of chapter 1 of the book, and then a bit of development from that. So the account of Hegel's method of normative argumentation that I offer takes a rather controversial stance within the secondary literature on this issue. While almost all of Hegel's readers acknowledge that the systematic frame of his thought and its metaphysical commitments were central to Hegel's own self-understanding of his general philosophical project, and thus of his social and political philosophy as well, the consensus view that has taken hold in the field really since the mid-1980s has been that these features are no longer, the systematic and metaphysical features, are no longer philosophically viable, and thus that his insights about social and political matters call for reconstruction, resting most often on some form of either historicized or simply dogmatic, in my terms, claims about recognition or self-actualization or reconciliation. The reading I propose rejects reconstructionist approaches because they are all fundamentally representationalist. They are representationalist precisely because they take the possibility and value of recognition, self-actualization, or reconciliation, or other concepts for granted. And as such, they expose themselves, their readings, to the charges of arbitrariness, regressiveness, and circularity, the Agrippine trilemma. In this way, they render the philosophical science of right nothing more than a compendium of probabilistic assertions, and they leave right itself as a sheer unwarranted constraint on freedom. Hegel's insights turns into, at best on their readings, in my view, recommendations, right? But that's not philosophically justified knowledge. So the systematic metaphysical approach for which I argue avoids, or seeks to avoid, the skeptical trilemma by showing how Hegel's claims are set within the secure epistemological framework afforded by the imminent and necessary unfolding of concepts into one another and the robust ontological moorings of a genuinely critical metaphysics. Hegel's deduction of right, his justification of normativity as such, I contend, is that for an act to be genuinely free, it must meet two conditions. A, the act must express an end in such a way that the agent, by virtue of the act, is self-determining. That's a self-determination condition talked about in chapter 2. And B, the expression of the end in the act must result in the end becoming actual. That is, it must become objective. This is the objectivity condition, which I introduced in chapter 2, but talk more about in chapter 3. Right denotes then the set of objective principles and structures that are entailed by the concept of freedom itself. In this sense, right or normativity really is nothing other than, but nothing less than, the necessary fulfillment of freedom. In this sense, it is what freedom most fundamentally is. Rather than its unwarranted restriction, it's not sheer arbitrary power or even a prudential employment of force. Now, the price for this justification of normativity, I acknowledge, is extremely steep. It's presuppositionlessness. And thus much of the very possibility of Hegel's systematic project, and certainly my reading of it, hangs on the possibility of pursuing a form of conceptual and existential analysis and argumentation that remains free from the intrusions of unwarranted assertions, that is, free from representational forms of knowledge. But is that even possible? Is the question. Hegel clearly recognized the high epistemic demand, the possibility of nothing less than what he called absolute knowing, that systematic forms of knowledge require of those who construct such systems, as well as those who would seek to expound their concepts and follow their proofs. Now, Hegel, in my view, struggled with this issue throughout his philosophical career. In fact, he proposed no less than, at least on my count, 4 distinct pathways, 4 distinct strategies, actually, for establishing the standpoint from which a genuine system of philosophical sciences could be constructed. Those 4 are these: the phenomenological route, which he pursued in the Phenomenology, 1807, the pathway through abstraction, which he introduces in the Science of Logic in 1812, but it's also in the 1817 edition of the Encyclopedia, so the first edition of the Encyclopedia. It's retained there, but in the later editions, but it's introduced there first. The route, so that's the second one. The third one, the route through the so-called positions of thought towards objectivity, which he introduces in the second edition of the Encyclopedia in 1827. and following the way through what is inadequately translated as reflection, nachdenken, literally to think after or in accordance with, oftentimes is translated as meditation for that reason as well, sometimes as reflection also. But I prefer to take it literally, nachdenken, to follow after, to think after, to think in accordance with. That was really introduced in 1827 as well in the second edition of the encyclopedia. So it's obviously not feasible in the time we have here to examine all those distinct ways. Let me just note that the first two pathways, the phenomenological route and the route through abstraction, form primarily epistemic, you could even call them Cartesian pathways into the domain of philosophical science. While the third and fourth routes, the path through the positions of thought and the pathway by way of reflection, are both fundamentally ontological pathways into this sphere. And I believe a fair reading of the historical record shows that the difference for Hegel between the pathways turns ultimately on their differing conceptions of experience, Erfahrung. In each, the standpoint of truth, of genuine philosophical insight, is attained through experience. So all four ways say we have to go from experience to truth. We have to go from experience into the standpoint of absolute knowing, the standpoint of constructing a position of presuppositionlessness. But the epistemological pathways, that is, pathways through a phenomenology, through abstraction, for those, experience is itself the work of consciousness as it selects, tests, and ultimately alters its expectations, its truth standards, as he calls them in the Phenomenology, as to what the world and knowledge are. While the ontological pathways, for the ontological pathways, experience, or Erfahrung again, is a repository. It's a wellspring is the way he thinks about it there. So he's changing his conception of what he means by Erfahrung, at least treating it differently. It's a repository or a wellspring. It holds the complex density of reality that provokes thought and nourishes thought as it seeks its fundamental categorical structure. But whether we are speaking of experience as in the epistemological pathways, as the dialectic immanent to our awareness of ourselves and the world that we inhabit, or as in the ontological routes, as the repository that stores the vast riches of feeling, empirical knowledge, and culture, Hegel's claim is that experience at bottom, so no matter which route you're talking about, experience at bottom always bears direct contact with being as such. We are, for Hegel, never trapped in the fleeting domain of our own personal or shared mental life, the circle of consciousness. We're not trapped in what Kant called a mere play of our inner sense. Rather, experience in both senses, whether we're talking about as a dialectic or as a wellspring, is always directly engaged with and responsive to being itself. As such, whether experience is a matter of vetting the positions of consciousness so that we obtain the standpoint of science, in the phenomenological and abstraction routes, or it is supplying the fund, right, the repository, that provokes thought to seek necessity and from which it draws the categories of the system itself, experience for Hegel always and inevitably offers reliable access to being and thus to truth as it is in and for itself. On this, the epistemological and the ontological routes into the system are agreed, and both kinds of route thus enable the attainment of presuppositionlessness that systematic forms of knowledge demand. Now I want to turn to the institutionalism thesis. This is focusing on what I say in chapter 3 of the book and then expanding a bit beyond that. Hegel's account of the systematic concept of objective spirit is, I contend, the core thesis of the philosophical science of right. And I wager it is also his most significant contribution to long-standing debates, historical debates, about the nature, standing, and design of social and political institutions. I argue in the book that conventional interpretations of objective spirit fail to grasp Hegel's insight because they fall prey to a representationalist view of objective spirit that takes objective spirit to be nothing more than a descriptive sociological account of the conventions by which societies have organized themselves and understood their shared forms of existence. But as we have noted with respect to the question of methodology more generally, the representationalist interpretation of objective spirit simply assumes social life in its complex interrelations, rather than offering a proof of the nature of institutionality itself. And as a result, it exposes objective spirit to the same skeptical charges of arbitrariness, regressiveness, and circularity. So I argue that Hegel's systematic account of objective spirit is necessary at once normative and ontological, and that it is only as such that it is able to avoid these skeptical traps. The key to the systematic account, I contend, is Hegel's demonstration of the objectivity of freedom. As I noted above, Hegel argues that to be genuinely free is not simply to be self-determining. He affirms that, but that's not sufficient. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. To have ends, you also have to have ends of self-determination embodied in principles and institutions, what I've called the objectivity condition of freedom. As conditions of freedom, then, a set of principles and social and political structures follow of necessity from the very concept of freedom itself. And they are normative because they make freedom itself possible, and they are ontological because in order to make freedom possible, they must actually obtain, which is to say, they must actually exist. Now, I acknowledge that this view sets institutions in what is clearly a perilous light. Hegel, in my reading, is undeniably an institutionalist. He holds that a complex set of social and political institutions, the structures, norms, and practices of the family, civil society, and the political state, what he calls the ethical powers of Sittlichkeit, are all necessary conditions for the possibility of being genuinely free. But this certainly seems to open the possibility that individuals, their choices, their conduct, and even their character must unilaterally be subordinated to, and thus restricted by, such institutional conditions, what Dieter Henrich has called strong institutionalism, strong institutionalism. The reaction against that has been to contest that for Hegel, these institutions are merely the sustaining conditions, right? They're sustaining conditions. They're the anchors and structures for the actualization of freedom, but that they do not themselves restrict or extrinsically constrain freedom, a position that's been called weak institutionalism. This is Jean-Francois Kervigan's view, weak institutionalism. My claim, going out of what I lay out in the book, is that the true distinctiveness of Hegel's systematic account of objective spirit is that it eludes the terms of this debate. It's neither strong nor weak, because its core insight about the relationship between freedom and institutions makes it neither a weak nor a strong form of institutionalism, but rather what I propose to call, and I'm hesitant to use this, but I can't find a better term for it, it's a form of inactivist institutionalism. So I'm picking up the term inactivism from debates in analytic philosophy of mind. I don't mean it in the way they do. Inactivism in philosophy of mind, analytic philosophy of mind, this is Varela, Thompson, not me, and others, have argued that the way we think about the mind's relationship to the world should be as enacted at the point of the flesh's contact with the world. That's not what I mean. I mean, it's enacting. I want to focus on the performative side of institutions. So let me say a little bit more about that. Hegel clearly conceives of institutions as authoritative structures that produce and ensure order and meaning in social and political life. Institutions of right in this sense shape action. To this degree, Hegel's theory stands securely in the mainstream of the history of thought about normative institutions. He's not unique in that regard. But where his doctrine begins to break new ground, I argue, is in its thesis that the fundamental way in which such institutions shape human action and agency is by these institutions being agents themselves. So this is an idea you don't find in Hegel, I think it's operative in Hegel, of institutional agency. So to be an agent and thus to affect change in the world, a being is typically said to have to meet three specific conditions. That being must be able to represent the states of affairs that it encounters. It must be capable of positing principles, ends, or norms with regard to these states of affairs. And finally, it must be able to pursue the realization of these aims within these states of affairs. That's the basic core threefold definition of agency. And I'm saying that institutions for Hegel have to have that. So I hold that the constitutional structure of the state, its governmental form for Hegel, enables it, the state in the broad sense right now, not just the political state. The state is encompassing civil society and the family for Hegel, so all those institutions. It enables for Hegel, it enables the state to fulfill precisely these requirements. That is to say, for Hegel, to be genuinely free, one must live under the authority of a set of institutions that enable one to act both individually and corporately in a manner that is self-governing. And such institutions are the requisite concrete embodiments of the abstract capacity of freedom, and the normative force derives precisely from their serving this function. But what these institutions require in order to fulfill this role, Hegel contends, is the actualization of their capacity, of these institutions' capacity, to lay down norms, define offices, and authorize policy. In short, for institutions of freedom to be genuinely authoritative, they must issue binding decrees. Binding decrees. And in this sense, they must be normative institutional agents themselves. On this reading then, which expands, I want to note upon what I argue in the book, so you'll find this nowhere in the book, it's in the further book I'm working on. The institutions of right literally enact the freedom of those over which they rule. They literally enact the freedom of those over which they rule. And to do this, these institutions cannot be robust restraints, so they can't be strong institutions, but neither can they be mere anchors, they can't be weak institutions. They can't be either one of those either. To enact freedom objectively, as Hegel's account of the political institutions of right requires, institutions must themselves be normative agents. Then finally, let me turn to social critique, and I'll be briefer here. I know I'm taking too much time, so I'm aware of that. I'll be briefer here. So I'm going to talk about social critique. I conclude my study of Hegel's theory of normativity by turning to a question whose proper place, we could say, really lies outside the strictures of the system of right itself. That is the question of social critique. By this, I mean that the practice of employing normative standards to examine and evaluate the soundness of the claims that various and sundry existing institutions or practices make to be authoritative, just, and good, in a word, their claims to be right, stands for Hegel as an extra systematic polemical usage of reason. It does so, however, not because social and political critique is wholly separated, not because it's wholly separated from the concepts, principles, and doctrines of the philosophical science of right itself, nor because, as has so often been claimed, because his theory leads to quietism or accommodationism. That, as he says in the infamous preface to the philosophy of right, the owl of Minerva, that is the owl of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, takes flight only at dusk, that all philosophy can be nothing more than, as he famously puts it, its own time grasped in thoughts. And those are supposed to be statements of quietism and accommodationism. So to the contrary, I argue that we can rightly speak of a distinctly Hegelian form of critical theory, and we could do so for basically two reasons. First, Hegel draws a clear distinction between the systematic and extra-systematic functions of reason. The systematic function is, as we have seen, working from the standpoint of absolute knowledge to construct a system of concepts that are at once structures of thought and categories of being that follow from one another immanently and necessarily. The extra-systematic function of reason is heuristic and polemical rather than demonstrative. It seeks to engage, as the extra-systematic function, it seeks to engage to persuade its audience, ultimately even to educate or form them, this is bilden or bilden, to form them of and in accord with the truths, the normative principles and institutions set forth in the science of right. They do so, however, through the usage of the signs, symbols, and narratives that a specific historical life world affords, which is to say, through the employment of the resources precisely of representation. This distinctly Hegelian conception of what Kant called the public use of reason makes use of representation to lead its audiences to insights that can only be sufficiently grounded in the system itself. In this way, representation and systematicity remain distinct, and the former serves the ends of the latter, right? Representation serves the end of systematicity. To engage in social critique, then, for Hegel is to be guided by the systematic principles and doctrines of objective spirit. But to engage one's social and political world with those insights, not by setting out systematic deductions, right? You don't construct the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences as an act of social critique. You do social critique by engaging the cultural resources that can be seen as already embodying or as indicating, their signs, indicating as a kind of promissory note even, what the science of right itself demands. So first, he's laid that out, so that's possible. But secondly, not only does Hegel have the rudiments on this reading of a genuinely distinctive conception of critical theory, we can see Hegel himself actually practicing this art in his own occasional essays, his speeches, and reviews, but above all, in the prefaces to all his published works. He begins every preface by saying, in prefaces, we can't do science. In prefaces, we are polemical. That's sometimes taken to be a kind of devaluing of the prefaces, and it's clearly distinguishing of them from the kind of systematic argumentation that goes on in the science itself, or goes on in the system itself. But that is not a dismissal of them. Right? It is, in fact, a recognition that they play a different function. So they're playing this function of a polemical function, which is supposed to be educative, which is supposed to be formative, and forms you in accord with truth. So that's how I propose to read the famous line from the preface to the Philosophy of Right about recognizing reason as the rose and the cross of the present. This image alludes at once to the symbolism of the 17th century secret religious society, the Rosicrucians, who employed a St. Andrew's cross and a set of roses as its emblem, and to Luther's coat of arms, which had a black cross in the midst of a heart surrounded by white roses. So it does both double duty for the Rosicrucians and for Luther. What we see here, I contend, and we can go to those if you want, but that's the basic historical references. What we see here, I contend, is Hegel employing a cultural artifact, a representational image, and investing it with systematic significance. That to be genuinely free is to stand not in something particular and contingent, but in that which is in and for itself, in the objective. He appeals to the association that his audience would make by way of this emblem to what he calls the distinctive principle of Protestantism, and to the legacy of the magisterial Reformation, a social and theological revolution in which Luther, according to Hegel, inaugurated the turn to subjectivity, conscience, and conviction. His call here is thus, Hegel's call, is thus to compel his historical community, his own public, to complete and not simply restore what Luther had begun, a reformation not only of doctrine, not only of Lehre, but of life, Leben itself. The rose and the cross of the present is therefore an appeal to tradition to transform the present into a world that actually embodies, not just inwardly, but outwardly as well, the demands for a just social and political world. The demands that not only these are demands that only the philosophical science of right can authoritatively establish against the threats of skepticism, but which it alone remains incapable, that science remains incapable of actually bringing about. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. This was excellent. We're going to be opening the floor. Anyone can post his own comments or questions to Professor Thompson. I have here, well, this is, I have a couple of questions here from the WhatsApp from YouTube. One question is relating precisely to your view of the philosophy of right vis-a-vis the phenomenology of the spirit, philosophy of mind, and phenomenology of mind, of spirit, and the encyclopedia. Are you assuming a continuity between the different developments of Hegelian philosophy? This must be a broad question. How would you address this question? There is another question here. If you don't mind, I'll bring two questions at once.
Yeah.
So another question is regarding the problem of history or philosophy of history in your book. What do you make of Hegel's philosophy of history, since this is not explicitly mentioned in your book? And how do you see the philosophy of history vis-a-vis his philosophy of right? Thank you.
Yeah. So let me take the second question first, and I'll come back to the first question second. How do I view the philosophy of history, Hegel's philosophy of history in respect to the philosophy of right? It is not mentioned in my book, and that was purposeful because other than the discussion about historicism, which is in the book, I wanted to separate Hegel's discussion of the philosophy of history, or better put it this way, philosophy of right. I want to separate out his discussion of the philosophy of right from an account of the philosophy of history, because I think that they're too often conflated. That it's presumed that when he starts talking about objective spirit, he's automatically talking about history, when he manifestly is not, right? If you look at the text, history doesn't come until the end, and it doesn't come into the end for a reason. It's deduced there. It's actually justified in its position there. So my view is that, and Hegel's very clear about this, that a historical account of right is not a systematic account of right. A historical account of right will get you only an empirical probabilistic generalization about right. It won't get you a systematic necessary deduction about right. And so he distinguishes his own procedure from that of the historical school, right? He's worried about various historical figures, but the historical school in general is what he's working from. And he separates out his methodology, his project from that. You see, this is in the remarks to paragraph 3, paragraph 4 in the introduction to the philosophy of right. But positively, what I would want to say, I'm actually writing about this. This is in the second book that follows this up. The philosophy of right does have an account of history, obviously. It is a normative history, a normative philosophical history. And that is to say, it's an account of historical development that's judged in accordance with the principle of objective freedom itself. So he lays out there an account of 4 different types of political regimes, and they are assessed by their adequacy or their concreteness or their determinacy with regard to the fulfillment of the demands of right itself. So that, what I call in the book, the axiom of the hierarchy of right, plays out there in the philosophy of history as the criterion by which he constructs that philosophy of history. That's not to say there isn't a ton of problems with that, of course there is, but that's basically the way I approach that. So Hegel is not, the way I tend to put this is, Hegel is his claim is this: history is rational, but reason doesn't necessarily have a history. Right? These are not the same thing. Right? Is the way to distinguish that. Right? He thinks that history is rational, but that doesn't mean the flip side of that reason is necessarily and integrally historical. The other way of putting that is Hegel is not Herder. Right? Hegel is not Herder. This is my sort of mantra that I try to drum into people about that. Now about the phenomenology and the rest of the system as it relates. I hold this view that, as I alluded to in my remarks today, I think of the phenomenology, I think this is what Hegel thought of the phenomenology, as an introduction to, a leading into, an Einleitung, right, a leading into of the system itself. It is not the system. So I don't think, well, let me say that positively. I think what that means is that literally none of the stuff in the phenomenology is Hegel's own positive doctrine. It's his own view about things. It's not the case. What he's doing there is in my view, what the phenomenology is 400 pages worth of epistemological demonstration that every truth standard that we can conceive has been and is being tested by consciousness and altered by consciousness and shown through the philosophical we, as he says in the phenomenology. We can show this. The phenomenology shows us that the end result of that is necessarily absolute knowing. So in that sense, it's all preparatory for absolute knowing. Absolute knowing is then spelled out in the system itself. So I take the phenomenology not to be an account of what Hegel thought about various matters. It's treated differently about that quite often. I know that, but I think Hegel didn't think of it that way, and I don't think that makes sense of it that way. And that the system that is the encyclopedia, the science of logic, the philosophy of right. The system in those presentations, those published presentations, I often remind people, Hegel wrote 4 books. I know we have a lot more on the shelf, but he only published mature works, 4 books, right? The Phenomenology, Science of Logic, Philosophy of Right, and the Encyclopedia. And the Encyclopedia has 3 editions, right? So it's worth remembering that. And the Encyclopedia and the Science of Logic and the Philosophy of Right are all part of the system, whereas the Phenomenology is preparatory for that. What I tried to lay out in my comments today is that he developed not only a phenomenological route into the system, but also 3 other routes that he elaborates. So this was an ongoing problem. Remember, he only tries to go back. The Phenomenology is his masterpiece for a lot of people. He published it in 1807. He only went back and tried to put out a second edition of it on the year in which he was dying, 1831. So it's only then that he's trying to work on it. Right. And there he's correcting it and changing it. I can talk more about that. But what that says to me is he's been working on that problem and continued working on the problem of how do you lead someone from the natural attitude, to put it in phenomenological terms, the natural attitude, certainly in phenomenological terms, the natural attitude into science. He's been working on that problem throughout. That's always concerned him. It's always what's in the introduction, the prefaces to all the major works. So that's the way I think that they relate. If that answers the question somewhat good.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. There is another question here from James William, and a second question from Ajamir. James, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Professor, my English is a bit rust, but I'll try. Again, about the relationship and what is the nature of the relationship between spirit and nature? that you really pick it apart, but it wasn't quite clear because it wasn't in a position. It's not duality. Then how that leap from nature to spirit? How do you define? Can you enlighten us a bit on
Thank you
that
for
point? And then, and just quickly about the structure of the book, it was quite interesting because reading it, I was thinking about, well, how can he dug himself out from the system? And then by the end, well, representation comes with social criticism. And how, mainly about the structure, how could you define that system well, and you did, and then leap to the representationalist to bring social critique right at the end? How do you come up with such insight, and what makes you do it? What makes you do it?
No, thank you for those. Those are wonderful questions. So thank you for those. So let me talk about the spirit-nature relationship first. So let me tell you what I'm trying to avoid, what I think Hegel avoids, and what I worry is the way in which we approach Hegel. And it's reflected in what you said. I don't think you're wrong about this. So I'm not objecting to anything you said. It's reflected in the way we talk about it, as though the move from nature to spirit was a leap. Right? That's the term you use. I think that's right. No, I don't think I think that's right. I think that's the way people think about it. Robert Pippin, for example, right, talks about the spirit-nature relationship as one of compatibilism. Right? That's the way he talks about it. And I think that's representative of a general view that Hegel is not a thinker of opposition. Ultimately, he thinks about identity and difference, right? So he's a thinker that allows us to think about the compatibility of nature and spirit, and that's a useful thing. And so we should be able to take that and move forward. I resist or reject that way of presenting it. And I'll tell you what I do think about it on the other side of this, but I reject that because it enters that discussion with assumptions. The assumption that I'm worried about most often is that nature is itself mechanistic and therefore requires some sort of spiritual intervention, some sort of compatibility, a space of compatibility to make it compatible with freedom, right? So it's the freedom nature debate, determinism debates are really behind that. And what Hegel says, right, so I quote this in the book, as you alluded to this, is that nature is prior to spirit. That's literally true in the system itself. But spirit is the truth of nature. Now that line, truth of, that's a formulation that's absolutely all over Hegel. He loves it, right? He's saying one thing is the truth of another. And it's typically, so he would say, right is the truth of freedom, right? That's the same sort of move we see him making. And that goes to this claim, this idea I have in the book about retrogressive grounding. Retrogressive grounding. So his claim is that if what I've shown you about nature is correct in the philosophy of nature, if what I've shown you about nature is correct, then nature is inherently already itself spirit. So there's no leap, right? Spirit is the process. And he ends this, the philosophy of nature by talking about the life process, right? And he says the life process, which is really at the level of the genus rather than the species. That's really what he's worried about. And he says, that's a process that, yes, individuals will die, individuals will go away and pass away, but the genus will continue, will move on. He says that process, which is not mechanistic, by the way, right? This is the life process itself, and it's not reducible to the mechanisms of atoms connecting with one another or not, material bits and connecting with one another or not. He says this is a process that is already a development of negation that is already spirit itself. And that's when he makes the transition into the philosophy of spirit. And then he says, okay, the philosophy of spirit then is about the relationship between spirit as this, the result and ground of nature, but how does it relate to nature? It relates to it as something it confronts, which is spirit of, that's the subjective spirit. It relates to it as something it constructs into second nature, which is objective spirit. And then it relates to it as its own, it completes itself in it. That's absolute spirit. So that's the way I understand the spirit-nature relationship, very generally and very much more to say about that, but that's at least a general perspective on that matter. Then about the structure of the book. I'm glad you asked about this because this is really, you know, when I was writing the book, what was going on, right? And why did I end the book with an account of Hegel's critical theory? And as I try to articulate at the beginning, I don't think I do it very well, but as I try to articulate very clear, I try to articulate it at the beginning of the conclusion. I had come to the end of a book that said basically the following. Hegel has an account of normativity. That account of normativity is systematically justified. It's systematically justified because I've been able to show for Hegel that it flows imminently and necessarily from freedom, period, full stop. And then I give a sketch of the Mester argument of the philosophy of right. And so, we're done, we're good. And I thought, well, that's an account of the book, but that doesn't really say much about how that theory could or could not function as a genuinely normative critique of society, political policies, whatever. And so I thought that, and behind that, of course, is this idea that, well, that's because Hegel doesn't have anything to say about that. He's a quietist, he's a accommodationist. All of this was really in service to an ideological function, which is to say, propping up or setting a new foundation for a regime that would be, if not totalitarian, I don't think that works, but at least his own present day reforms to that. And so I began to want to try to explore that. So this is the motivation for the conclusion. This is the motivation for why the book ends with a critical theory rather than simply the systematic justification thereof. And that really forced me back to, so you asked about how did I get these insights, that forced me back to thinking about, because I'd framed the book in terms of systematicity and representation. It sent me back to thinking about that again. And what this convinced me of is I've held for a long time that the prefaces have this polemical function, right? It's fairly obvious. You read Hegel, he says all prefaces are polemics. And I started thinking, well, I used to read that as a kind of dismissal, right? Don't trust prefaces, they're not science, get to the book itself. So whenever this is the way I do it practically in my seminars, when I teach the phenomenology, we don't read the preface first, we read it last. When I teach the philosophy of right, we don't read the preface first, we read it last for these reasons, right? Let's get on to the science itself, because you can get lost. As anybody who's read the phenomenology knows, for example, that's 60 pages worth of preface. You can get lost in that very easily, all the polemics that are going on there. But what I decided to do was say, well, there's something going on there that's more interesting than simply I'm carrying out academic debates and I'm situating myself in the field, which he clearly is, but he's not just carrying out that kind of polemic. He also says, and he says this in the phenomenology, he says it again in the philosophy of right, he says it in the preface to the science of logic, he says it in the preface to the encyclopedia, that these prefaces have an educative function. They're there to form, shape, mold, build, and take us from one place to another. And from the one place is where we are to the other place is ultimately to the science. But what I wanted to suggest about the philosophy of right is that it has an additional function, and that is to call or compel its audience to engage in not revolution, Hegel's not a revolutionist, but reform. And that means taking what's already there and transforming it into what it ought to be, sort of standard normative critique at that point. And that's what I wanted to try to carve out and lay out. And that's why that focus on the rose and the cross of the present, strangely, because I've always hated that passage, right? Frankly, I never liked it when I was reading. I thought, who is this written for? What does that matter? That's nice, but, what's that got to do with the concepts, And I became convinced that this is where representation plays, not just a, opening to skepticism problem, right? Which is the way I present representation, mainly in the book. But here it actually plays a motivational role. And, the standard romantic critique of rationalism is that it gets you to believe the right things, but it can't actually compel you to act in accordance with those right things. So, standard thing about Kant is he can show you the moral law, but he can't give you any motivations to actually do it. Kant thinks, by the way, right, that the moral law is sufficiently motivational on its own, but no romantic ever thought that. They thought you had to write about it, you had to sing about it, you had to, all these sorts of things. And Hegel, to me, is addressing that concern there. He's speaking to that concern. I can show you what the justification of normativity is, what the justification of right is, but that in and of itself won't necessarily compel you to actually go out and create these conditions. So knowing what's right is not sufficient to actually go out and create what's right. There's, as Aristotle long ago told us, there's weakness of will, right? You won't go out and do, just because you know what is right doesn't mean you will do what's right. Plato was wrong, right? You won't go out and do it. And so Hegel is trying to speak to that concern and say, look, you already know this, right? You already actually believe this. There are cultural artifacts that already testify to this, that you, whether you're a believer, whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Lutheran, doesn't matter. It's part of your life world, that you already affirm this. And what I'm calling for you to do is to work out what you already believe and affirm. I'm spelling it out scientifically. We've got to work it out through practice. So that's why I end the book with that sort of strange for this book, right? This, it's not just about Lehre, it's not just about doctrine, it's also about Leben, it's about your life. So, sorry, too long of an answer to a much better question.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Two more questions here. One from, a couple of questions from Professor Ajemir Bavarescu, our Hegelian friend.
Yeah.
Your thesis on systematic metaphysical reading involving normative theory implies two questions. First, how do you consider the section morality to explain normative reading? And second, as Professor, well, how do you relate the logic operating in the figures of law? Some people criticize Hegel for implementing a metaphysics concept operating in the real, let's say, ontology, being equal to thinking. This would be merely speculative normativity. So how Professor Thompson reconstruct the practice in philosophy of right?
Yeah. So these are tough questions, so let me acknowledge that first. And I love these questions. These are at the core of what I'm trying to think about. So let's talk about moralitate section first. I read the moralitate section, as I suggest in chapter 3, I read the moralitate section as advancing the claim that to be free is not only to have ownership of property, which is what the abstract right says, to be able to transfer it to others, but also to have intentions and motivations with respect to it, to have what he calls their subjectivity, not just personhood. And so in that sense, it's advancing the idea that part of what it is to be normative is to have a right to conscience, Now, just like the abstract right section shows that having a right to personhood ends in ownership, but ownership can be violated by theft, criminality, and therefore the requirement of punishment. Just like that ends with that discussion. So the moralitate section ends with a different, right, but still this question about how the right to conscience can ultimately be vacuous and violated as a result of that. So its vacuity, right, its vacuousness flows from the fact that it affirms the good, and the good has no content. Because the good has no content, it opens up the possibility of acting according to one's own conscience, and according to one's own conscience that has no objective content to it, therefore means whatever I want to do, and therefore it opens up the possibility of acting evil, right? Acting wrongly and acting in evil. That's a matter of subjective conscience, and that's its unfolding into its negativity at that point, just like we saw abstract right and personhood unfold into the negativity of crime. So subjectivity unfolds into the negativity of evil. Irony is the way he puts it in the end, right? Deceptiveness. And what he takes that to entail is that we have to have concreteness, right? As what's already actually there, right? Which is the unity of abstract right and moralitate itself, or personhood and subjectivity. That's what Sittlichkeit is, according to him. So I take that to be part of the argument for unfolding what right is abstractly and then more concretely in subjectivity, but that subjectivity having its own inadequacy, its own lack, or better said, its insufficiency, its abstractness. And that's what entails Sittlichkeit, or ethicality, ethical life from there. Now about the logic in the figures of law. Many years ago, I wrote a dissertation. That dissertation held that there was a logical structure to civil society in Hegel. I still believe that that's the case. But at the time, I thought that meant, this is where I think I'm wrong, so this is what I want to try to back off and away from. I don't want to claim that you can match up particular logical structures from the science of logic or the encyclopedia of logic, that you can take those over and say, that's what's at work in a particular structure, a particular concept in the philosophy of right. I think that kind of, Adrian Pepperzak always used to say, this kind of one-to-one matching doesn't work that way, right? Doesn't work that way. I think he's right about that. And I was guilty of that at the time, right? So I wanted to find, which which structure within the philosophy of science, the science of logic, matched up with this particular moment in the civil society. I think that's wrong. So what you see in the book is my attempt to articulate what the science of logic's relationship is to real philosophy in general, but certainly the philosophy of right in particular. And that is to say, it's a methodological relationship, and it's also a metaphysical relationship. So the methodological relationship is one I've tried to lay out in terms of eminence, regressive grounding, necessity. So that's the methodological side of it. That's the systematic methodology. The ontological side of it has to do with, you see this borne out in the account of freedom and the account of right, is to say, it's about something is what it is only by becoming other than what it is. And by becoming other than what it is, it becomes itself, right? And that is what's going on in both freedom and what's going on ultimately in right itself. Right is the fulfillment of that for freedom, and that has more determinations in right itself. And that's what I've tried to take over from the science of logic at that point. And I think of that as both methodological and ontological. So epistemological and ontological, if you can put those terms.
Thank you, Kevin. Another question here from João Jung. Would you like to read your question, João? Ajamir, can you unmute?
I have no camera, but I can ask.
Well, you can read your question, João. Go ahead.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Professor Nitamar, Professor Ajamir. First of all, thanks for your talk, Professor Thompson. It's an honor to have you here. And my question is that argumenting the systematic metaphysics method on your book, we have read that the spirit and the nature must be under the logic's view. However, there's also a sense that the logic is an abstraction, as expressed on page 43. Despite Hegel's intention in taking a content into logical form. Thus, how should we read the logic's role inside the Hegelian system? It's here the core of a metaphysical content into the same system. Thank you.
So thank you for that question. It's a fantastic question. I've thought much about this, but despite the fact that I've thought much about it, I'm going to say very little about it because I'm unsure about what all needs to be said about it, frankly, is a way of putting that. But let's deal with this way. What's the relationship of the logic to the rest of the system? Right? What's the role? Hegel addresses this at the end of the encyclopedia itself. This is the famous three syllogisms that are at the end of the encyclopedia itself. And he says, look, you can take this structure the following ways. You can say it's the logic, the relationship between the three parts of the system is the logic, nature, and spirit. And he says you can read them sequentially, right? And in that sense, logic is the most abstract, nature is more concrete, spirit is even more concrete than that. So you're quite right to charge me with, aren't you engaged in a kind of abstractness with respect to spirit, right? Aren't you, by appealing back to the logic, aren't you engaged in a kind of abstraction? And Hegel says, yes, that's exactly right. That's the way we encounter it. That's the way we read the system. I acknowledge that. But having worked through it that way, we know that's not the ultimate truth. He says, this is the third syllogism. I'll leave the second one to the side. The third syllogism, he says, is the philosophical syllogism. And that's where the logic is in the middle. The logic is das Mitte. It plays the middle term, right? And in that regard, it is what, and this is Hegel's understanding of the middle term in syllogisms, is they're not just the way you pass through, right, the major term to the minor term. It's actually how the major term and the minor term are generated and created. They come out of the middle, right? The middle divides itself into them. And so if that's right, then the logic is the originating account of ontological categories. They get specified naturally, get specified spiritually in those other two sections of the book. So I think in that regard, it is, right for the charge of abstraction. I grant you that, but I don't think we should think, or it's inadequate to think of the logic as form content. It's not, the logic is not the form, and then the real philosophy is the content that it gets placed upon. As far as I understand Hegel, he's a conceptual realist. He thinks that concepts are all the way down. They generate their own determinations. And so what we're talking about is the logic of the real itself. And the science of logic provides the most fundamental account of that ontology. But that's not then slapped upon nature or slapped upon spirit. and imposed upon those, it's actually specified more determinately in each one of those, but it's still the same concepts at work. So that's the way I would try to address that. You want to come back and ask me more about that?
Well, thank you very much. We have more questions here. Let me see. Okay, another one from Professor Bavarescu. In the first chapter on method, you present the critique of representation. Now, how do you defend dialectical method as the engine of normativity? However, the ones who want to read the philosophy of right without metaphysics seem to wish to eliminate what makes Hegel's philosophy systematic, namely, they're trying to eliminate the problem of the relationship between the idea of truth and its effective reality, Wirklichkeit, of the concept of freedom. Now, is there a danger of eliminating the critical potential of the metaphysical logic over the institutions and the figurations, the shapes, the forms of the state, both from a point of view, a normative point of view, as well from an economic standpoint? What do you make of these comments?
Yeah, Nietzsche, if you can help me, could you restate the first point? I got the second point. I'll respond to both of them, but just restate the first one because I think I lost it in the course of that.
Yeah, it's the first chapter on method. You present the critique of representation.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, yeah.
I see it now. I'm sorry. You don't need to. So here's the way I would say that. My first temptation is always to say this. I don't think Hegel has a dialectical method. This goes back a long time to a whole strand of people who Ken Leroy Stubb used to claim this all the time, that there is no dialectical method in Hegel. I think there's something to that. I don't mean it in the same way that he did, but and what he meant by it, right, and this I do agree with, is that Hegel doesn't have a dialectic that he then, as a form, as a structure, that he then applies to things. He doesn't dialecticize things, right? So Ken Leroy Stubb used to say about the phenomenology, it doesn't have a dialectical method. What it shows is that consciousness is inherently dialectical itself, right? So it's not a dialectical method in the sense of an extrinsically applied form onto some material that we dialecticize in some sort of way. We show the dialectic within the matter itself, right? Die Sache selbst is already dialectical itself. I think, so he said that about the phenomenology. I think that's true in the system, right? I don't think Hegel ever once says, now we have a dialectical system. The following has to take place in a dialectical system. So what next follows is X, Y, and Z because of that. What he does do is say, if you analyze this concept, it entails certain determinations. Those determinations ultimately turn on negativity of that concept from itself. And because of that, it becomes something that transforms itself into something else. And your job as a philosopher is to track that and follow that. He calls this in the philosophy of rights. This is in paragraph, I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I could have it wrong, 29, 30, something like that. He calls this the higher dialectic, right? The higher dialectic is not simply the dialectic of Plato, which is the dialectic, at least in the early dialogues, of this confrontation with one another, right? But it's really our spelling out and tracking of these dialectical movements within concepts themselves. So when you say I'm critiquing representation, I certainly am. That's Hegel's critique of representation. I don't want to then presume or assume a dialectical method, because that would put me straight back in the problem of representationalism, right? I think anyone who reads Hegel as having a dialectical method is guilty of representationalism. And the way you get out of that is you demand immanence. This is why Hegel begins literally every book by saying, now we must devote ourselves to the Sache selbst, right? And in the logic, that's being, pure being. In the philosophy of right, that's the idea of right and its actualization. Notice the philosophy of right's the philosophy of rights, not the philosophy of freedom. So it really begins with abstract right? That's the beginning of the philosophy of right proper. The freedom stuff in the introduction is really from the subjective spirit in this in the science. So we have to devote ourselves and begin with that. And we can make no predeterminations, make no assumptions about where that will necessarily go. Right? Stephen Holgate puts it this way quite often. I think this is quite useful. If Hegel's right, which we have to hold him to this, right? So that's the way to be critical about what Hegel's doing, hold him to his own demands. If Hegel's right about his demands, then we don't really know where we're going, right, in the system until we get there. We don't know where this is going to take us. So I know there's a tendency to want to treat Hegel and teach Hegel by saying, well, we know where this goes, so we know how he gets there. Hegel is exactly the opposite of that in trying to lay out these demonstrations, right? We don't know when we start the science of logic, pure being, that it will necessarily entail actuality, Wirklichkeit, that it will necessarily entail the concept, Begriff. We don't know those things. And so it has to be shown, it has to be proven. And it's by proof of imminent necessary derivation that we reach those retrogressive grounds in actuality and in concept. So that's what I would say about the first point. The second point, I mean, I'm not really clear about what he's trying to get at there. So that's maybe my failure more than the question's failure. What I would say about that is that.
Sorry.
Well, please.
Sorry. Is there any danger of eliminating the critical potential of metaphysics coming from logic over the institutions and the shapes, figurations of the state, both from a normative standpoint and from an economic standpoint?
Yeah, see, it all depends there on critique. Right? What do we mean by critique? So, there's I was at a conference recently, we enumerated probably 12 different senses of critique. Let me keep it down to just 2 for today. There's the Kantian sense of critique, which means to the self-interrogation, the tribunal of reason of itself, the self-examination of reason by itself. That's one sense of critique. And ultimately that's asking the question of the conditions of the possibility of something. So to be critical in that sense has a specific Kantian meaning of what are the conditions of the possibility of experience, what are the conditions of the possibility of moral agency or morality more generally, those kinds of questions. That's one sense of critique. The other sense of critique is the one I talk about at the end of the book, which is social critique. Right, which is the examination and evaluation of practices and institutions that claim to have authority to be right, good, and just. I want to say, as I try to lay out in the book, that in both senses of critique, Hegel is satisfying the demands, because he's ultimately asking, in the Kantian sense of critique, what is the condition of the possibility of freedom? And the condition of the possibility of freedom is a set of principles and institutions that make it possible. And those institutions have to be actual in order for freedom to be not just a thing, a capacity, but actually something that can be done, can be realized, it can be actualized. And that's what the message of the science of right is, as I understand it. It's responding to that question. But I also think that allows us, because it's able to do that, because it addresses or answers to the first demand of critique, that it allows us to be able to do the second kind of critique. That is, that we can engage in social and political critique in the more common sense, which is to say, as the evaluation of institutions and practices in terms of normative standards. But we don't have normative standards, right? This is where I think Hegel is different than other critical theorists in a lot of ways. We don't have those critical standards. We don't have those normative standards without an appeal to a critical metaphysical account of what those concepts of right and freedom really are. So you can't, on Hegel's view, criticize an economic structure. You can't criticize a political structure unless you have the normative standards of what an economic structure ought to be, what a political structure ought to be. Only insofar as you have that can you actually carry out a genuine critique of, in the sense of evaluation, you carry out a critique of those kinds of structures. So I actually think that Hegel thinks, and I think he's right about this, that the only way you can really have the power of social critique, political critique, is by having the resources of a genuinely critical metaphysics.
Thank you, Professor Thompson. Another question, couple of questions here from Professor Josivan Guedes. Let's see if we can unmute you, Ajemir. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Nitamar. Thanks, Ajemir. Professor, thank you for conference. great conference. And your book, Hegel's Theories of Normativity, is based on metaphysical approach normativity. Why it is necessary to depend on metaphysics? Hornet, Toynbee, and others have highlighted this problem of metaphysical dependence on law and politics in Hegel. For example, problems of collapsing, of intersubjective, of super-institutionalizations, Sittlichkeit, Ethicity, and the democratic deficit in the participation of citizens in the public sphere.
Well, thank you for this. So I think I want to talk mostly here about Toyneson's approach to this. So let me just say a little bit about Honneth for just a second before I get to Toyneson. You're quite right to ask this question. Why is it necessary to depend on metaphysics? Why do we need metaphysics? What the standard retort these days, all coming out of kind of a Rawlsian background, which is to say we should not have any grand overarching commitments in the public sphere, right? If we're going to settle political debates, we've got to at least set aside, if not outright abandon, we have to set aside our grand narratives or grand commitments, and not have any of those robust theories at play here, no metaphysics at play here, to do a genuinely liberal theory and therefore critique. So paradoxically, right, in Rawls's debate with Habermas, Habermas is the one who says, right, back to Rawls, you can't do that, right? You can't enter the public sphere without your metaphysical commitments. That's ludicrous. Practically is the way I read Habermas is approaching that, right? That's just feasibly, it's infeasible. You can't do that. So to make that demand is already too much. And I always thought there was something right about Habermas. Now, I disagree with Habermas about a lot of other things, but I think Habermas was onto something there. I think he's right about that. And I think that the payoff of that is to say something like this, is that, Honneth agrees with that. Honneth agrees that you can't have these kind of robust metaphysical commitments. But I think what he, despite that, he does have metaphysical commitments. It's metaphysical commitments about a certain kind of anthropology, philosophical anthropology, that's rooted in love and respect and trust and all the things that go into recognition that come out of recognition. So he gets this from Mead, right? He gets this, draws this out of the pragmatist George Herbert Mead. That's where he goes to get this stuff. And then he says, well, now look, that's recognition. We can meet up with that at the Hegelian form of recognition and spin that out into much greater things. Wonderful and great, but that's not getting rid of metaphysics. That's just covering up metaphysics by calling it something else, calling it a physics, not admitting that your philosophical anthropology is in fact a metaphysics, I guess is the best way to put that. So that's about Honneth. So even when they say we don't have metaphysics, they actually do. Habermas is guilty of this as well. Habermas will say I don't have a metaphysics, but he actually does. I think the practical claim that we can't enter the sphere without metaphysics is right. I also think it's theoretically the case, right? So philosophically, we should not enter. And here's where I want to talk about Toyneson, because I think Toyneson's really interesting about this. I'm talking about the book Sein and Shine. So when Toyneson argues in that book that the science of logic is carrying out an implicit critique, right? It's carrying out an implicit critique of an ideological formations of shine, right? Of illusion, of mere seeming. And what I love about that book is his attempt to show how Hegel, in carrying it, this is the way I read that book, so maybe you have a different view of it, but what Toyneson is actually arguing is that a genuinely critical metaphysics is the way to critique a dogmatic metaphysics, which is what he thinks ideology is. And that is an unwarranted assertion, set of unwarranted assertions. And mere claims to being, right, Sein, are what that really is. And what we have to do is see how Sein, Shine are ultimately failures in that regard, right? Because they're not sufficient unto themselves. Now, where Toyneson takes that is into ultimately the concept. He wants to read the concept as a form of intersubjectivity. So he actually has, a more robust sense of what intersubjectivity is, even over against Habermas or Honneth, for example. And I think that that's really interesting. I don't read the concept in terms of intersubjectivity, so I want to be clear about that. But at least what he's preserving in the logic is its critical function, but also its metaphysical status at the same time. So let me just take that as evidence for, more evidence for the claim that the way to do genuine critique is precisely by having its metaphysical foundations. Those metaphysical foundations can't be dogmatic, right? They can't be something along the lines of, well, we know Aristotle's right, so how do we decide the world ought to be? It has to be actually, has to be Kant's demands. It has to justify itself. And that's what I think Hegel tries to do. That's what the system is supposed to be.
Thank you, Kevin. Another question, since we are approaching our last quarter, we're supposed to finish at 5:30 or 3:30 Chicago time. Since you are someone who has worked so much on French post-structuralism, especially Derrida, Foucault, and different receptions of Hegel in France, what do you make of this postmodernist approach to Hegel, which tends to identify modernity and Hegelian universalism with a Eurocentric approach, therefore, that could be very difficult to be sustained nowadays, especially when you're thinking of racial, gender inequalities, etc. How do you respond to this challenge, especially when you have people like Habermas, who would say that thanks to Hegel, we can make a case for modernity? So how would you avoid this blackmail between modernity and postmodernism?
Yeah. So I'm trying to work on some of this now in terms of the philosophy of history specifically. So I've been thinking about this. Let me tell you where I'm at, but I still think this is a live issue in a lot of ways. So let me start off by saying what I think is fairly obvious, right? Hegel was a European centralist himself, right? So he had all the biases of his time and more. And this is about Hegel, the individual, the person, the man. And he's guilty as charged of all those things. You can find plenty of passages and actions in his own life that bear that out. You can find some actions that critique that, so we can do that thing, but that's all ultimately biographical. I don't think that's the way to ultimately address these questions. I think we have to acknowledge that, but that's not the work itself. That's not the thought itself. So is the thought inherently Eurocentric, for example, is one way of approaching this question. And I think in one sense it is, right? Hegel's account of the ripeness of the time, as he calls it, right? The time is ripe, as he puts it in the Phenomenology, is a claim about modernity and the possibilities born therein. He does himself think of it as almost exclusively, you can cite bits and pieces here and there, but he does think of it almost exclusively as a European modernity. So I'll be clear about that as well. But does his own thought commit into that? I'm not clear that it does. Right? I'm not clear that it does. There's a lot of reasons to think otherwise. I was, as you mentioned, I was trained at the University of Memphis. At the time when I was training at the University of Memphis, the director of my dissertation was Robert Bernasconi. Bernasconi has made the case that Hegel is a Eurocentrist racist. Right? That's his claim about Hegel. That's his claim about Hegel's philosophy as well. Right? And is one of the contributors to European racist views of modernity, but also of philosophy in general. He traces, he has a whole story to trace out about how the history of philosophy was constructed by Hegelians, and not a conspiracy theorist, it's just what happened. And they played out this narrative in their first histories in Germany in particular. But so I'm well aware of that critique. I've been schooled in that critique. I'm very aware of that critique. But I'm worried about the quickness that had, the quickness that's there to go to, for proof of this, to go to material that is not of the same standard as the published text. So what I mean by that is a lot of these cases are being made out of the lectures on the philosophy of world history. We have students' notes on what Hegel said in those lectures, like we do on his philosophy of art, like we do in his philosophy of religion, like we do on the history of, like we do in a lot of courses. And Hegel never published those, right? And he didn't publish those because, as I assume, he wasn't satisfied with the accounts there. he knew when to publish stuff. He published The Philosophy of Right. So he knew how to publish things that he had lectured about, and he continued to lecture about, actually. But he did not choose to publish those things. So the accounts that he gives of, for example, the philosophy of history in the science itself, in the system itself, is fairly short. It's 5 paragraphs, 6, 7 paragraphs, something like that. And it's not to say those paragraphs aren't troubling, they are, but they don't have all of the resources or all the evidence that we might want to make that are standardly used to critique Hegel about race, gender, class, and other things. And those passages are the ones that are really where you're going to have to make the case for, if we're going to interrogate Hegel about these things, that's where the interrogation needs to take place, in my view. And where I think it's problematic there, and I do think these are problematic, is that Hegel articulates there what he calls a providentialist theory of history. A providentialist theory of history. And because it's providentialist, it's unitary, it's directional, and it reaches a culmination. And I think that insofar as we are worried about a Eurocentric version of history, that's what we need to be worried about, are those claims about the nature of history, I guess is the way to put that. And I'm trying to figure out exactly what Hegel is committed to and what he's not committed to in that view. Right? So let me leave it at that for now as to where I would state my claims there.
Well, thank you very much. I really found your response very, very interesting. As I told you, I think Sheila Benabid tends to be very diplomatic also in the way she approaches these so-called dialogue of the deaf between modernists and postmodernists.
Yeah.
And she tends to say that Foucault was right, that we should avoid this as some kind of blackmail, right?
Yeah.
And that's precisely what you were doing in a very convincing way. Now, still relating to this problem, though, how would you respond to someone like Amy Allen's criticisms of the Hegelian idea of a progress? Do you think that the idea of a progress is this like something that really jeopardize a philosophy of history or an understanding of history that precisely avoids these shortcomings and pitfalls, as you just put it?
Yeah. So, Amy makes this claim about both Habermas and Hannett, that they are
right,
both,
exactly.
They both reject Adorno's insight that
exactly
history is not progressive, it's
right,
not providentialist, but that it actually reaches culmination. And that's the modernity thesis in both of them, right? That we have seen to certain points so we can progress from there. Let me take it back to Hegel, though, right? So I think Amy is onto something there about the reliance upon that. I think that what I would say at this point is that this is sort of no surprise in some regards that I would say this. I think Hannett and Habermas have a dogmatic relationship to that history. They assume it as a pretext for then doing what they want to do with either a theory of communicative action or a theory of recognition. And you see this differently, by the way, in Rahel Yegi, who has these same reliance on this as well. So I think Amy's critique, she doesn't, as far as I know, apply it to Rahel Yegi, but it applies to her as well. So just continuity in the critical theory tradition, or the Frankfurt School tradition more specifically. But regardless, does it apply to Hegel? Well, in one sense, of course, yes, right? He does have a developmental progressive view of history, but he doesn't assume that. He actually argues for it. And the argument for it, I think, is really what you have to go to and try to see if you can make the case. Notice the argument that he lays out is that history is progressive insofar as we judge it from the criteria, the standard involved is objective freedom. Mm-hmm. So it's only progressive in the sense of we're getting more and more better approximations of what objective freedom actually requires and demands. That's the way you judge history. And he says, that's not accounting for all facts. This isn't a factual history. It's a philosophical history. It's not a reflective history. He draws these distinctions in the world history, lectures on the philosophy of world history. He says it's none of those. It's a philosophical history, but a philosophical history means it's and this is my term for it, a normative history, which doesn't make any sense. That's a contradiction in terms. Much like normative ontology is a contradiction in terms. But that's to say that the is that things are is not what they truly are. And that's the standard, though, that we have to use to judge them as what they should be, what they ought to be. And that's what I take him to be doing with those types of political regimes that he lays out at the end of the Philosophy of Right, and why he adjudicates them, or why he thinks world spirit, right, is the adjudication. That's what world history is, the court of judgment about them. And that's what he's trying to lay out there and say, one is better than the former, right? One is better than the next because of its more complete, higher embodiment of objective freedom itself. So that's still progressive. I want to be clear. That's still an embracing of providence, as he understands it, right? That term he wants to give a systematic account of. But it's not necessarily Eurocentric. It's not necessarily that. Could be, can be, not necessarily Eurocentric. And it's not rooted in, as he calls it in the lectures on the philosophy of world history, it's not rooted in a geographical basis either, which is really where much of the claims about race flow into this. Not all of them, but it's where much of them come from.
Well, Professor Thompson, thank you very much. There is another final brief comment and a question from James William. Please, James, go ahead.
Okay. Just a brief comment, Professor.
Yes.
Thank you for everything. Not going too much into Rael Yegi's theory, but she has a construct, a dialect retrospect teleology that doesn't itself propose a progress, but says that it pretty much says that we can only realize what's progress once we look at the past and analyze it and see that we had not, how can we solve our contradictions? How is this freedom being actualized? That's pretty much her idea. Does that fits, or do you agree with something like that?
I certainly think that, so I agree with it to an extent. So I think that Rahel is onto something when she says that the account of historical development and progression, if we're going to use that term in it, development is one thing, progression is another, right? Is always retrospective, right? So in embracing this is the irony of the countersense in a way of this claim, is that in embracing providential history, we're not saying here's what the future will be. We're actually saying here's what the past has bequeathed to us. Here's what's left to us. And it's only in that retrospective view, only in so far as what we've received from it, can we then evaluate and see whether we have developed beyond or not that prior stage. And I do think that the history for Hegel is always retrospective in that specific sense, but it's also retrospective, it's also evaluative for him, which you have in Yegi as well. She wants to have a more restricted view of what that means, right, as I understand her. She wants to have a more restricted evaluative standard than Hegel. Hegel has objective freedom. She wants to stay with something like non-alienation, right, or a version of reconciliation, or a version of even recognition, although she doesn't really use that language. It's more about alienation for her. So it's self-ownership or self-relation in that sense, self-actualization, you could put it in those terms. I think Hegel has something broader than that. He wants to say, it's not just about agency, which is what that's focused on. It's about the social and political conditions under which agency takes place. So I think that broader view about what sociality entails and what the political structures have to be in order to be genuinely free, give Hegel a broader conception of that standard and by which you can judge prior political regimes. All that to say this, really, under Yegi, you can say that's alienating, right? You can say that capitalist structure is alienating. That's her claim. That's what she wants to use that for. And I think that's important and right. So let me be clear about that. But that doesn't say what would be non-alienating structures, right? What would be autonomous structures? What would be structures by which we could be genuinely self-determining? It doesn't give that as the standard. It simply says, well, they're not able to come back to themselves in and through that otherness. They're aliened from themselves, right? They're alienated from themselves. And that's what I think is lacking in that view. It's insufficient. It's insufficiently, this is an analytic term, so I apologize for this, but it's insufficiently robust, right? It doesn't have enough in the standard to really do the work that it needs to do.
Well, once again, Kevin Thompson, thank you very much for this brilliant talk, for these very instigating questions, remarks, and debates that we could carry out together here. Now, let's wish everyone a nice weekend. Yes. And thank you once again. Standing ovation for you for the
thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Meeting.
And can I just say, Nita?
Yes, please. Go ahead. Go ahead.
One last thing I just wanted to say.
Right. Go ahead.
Two things actually I wanted to say. I apologize for this. Thank you to everyone for spending the time working on this. Thank you for your engaging ideas. I'd love to hear more from you. If you have anything else you want to send me, I'll be glad to take a look at those and respond to you. I'd love to engage with you further about this text. Then a very minor thing. Someone wrote in the and I don't know who it was. Sorry. Wrote in the chat a reference to Toynason's The Repressed Intersubjectivity in Hegel's Philosophy of Right. I can't hold myself back from noting that's the essay I first read by Toynason when I was in grad school.
All right,
it convinced me to write a dissertation on Hegel. So I recommend that. It's 60 pages, I apologize, but I recommend that essay. It's a fantastic essay that goes to this problem of intersubjectivity versus concept and whatnot. It says in there that the central problem in Hegel is the problem of the transition from civil society to the state. I wrote a dissertation because of that statement. Right? So I want to leave you with that.
Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.